Hey, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of Esoteric Literacy. Today we're going to be talking about mediumship. Things like auto-writing, trance channeling, voices in the head, and stuff like that. And of course, we'll be discussing a little bit of how you can tell if it is authentic, fraud, deception, or some form of split personality disorder. Now, to begin with, I might want to address probably the most famous and most controversial aspect of mediumship and auto-writing and inspiration and stuff like that from the Holy Bible. There's a lot of controversy surrounding how this book was written, and the most common answer that you'll hear is that it is an inspired text. But what does that mean, inspired? Does that mean it was auto-written? Does that mean these people were hearing voices in the head? And when you get down to it, the more orthodox traditions do believe it was the voices in the head, and that they dictated it, what the angels were telling them to write. So it's not exactly auto-writing, which would be when a spirit takes over your hand and you're in an unconscious state, and you're writing, and the spirit is writing with your hand, and it'll be like, it won't look like your handwriting, it won't be your words. Dictation is when you hear the voices in your head and you are fully conscious and write it down yourself. That's how most theologians see the books being written. Of course, you'll see the famous paintings and wood carvings throughout the Catholic tradition of the evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, getting their ears whispered into by angels, particularly the angel Gabriel, and that's how they wrote down the Gospels. So they have this voices in your head theory or belief for that. And it's very peculiar, a contradiction that spreads throughout the Bible, the Old and New Testament, because the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy discuss how you should never associate with mediums, ventriloquists, or what we would call trance channelers, people who interpret dreams and omens, people who use the divining arts and astrology. They should never associate with these people. But then the Old Testament was written by these people. Daniel interpreted dreams and omens. Ezekiel was a chance channeler, as God said through Ezekiel, I will make thy tongue cleave to the roof of thy mouth, and you will not speak. And then a few sentences later he says, I will open thy mouth, and you shall say, so saith the Lord, Yah. And that means he was a trance channeler. Later it says that when he went to preach in Jerusalem, the Spirit of the Lord came over him and opened his mouth, and the words of the Lord were spoken. And there are all these people who would get visions from God and then write about them and preach about them. So all of the prophets of the Old Testament were mediums and dream interpreters and diviners and spiritists, and yet the Bible contradicts itself by saying you should not consult or believe these people. So it's a very confusing thing, and I think this is a perfect description of where mediumship is in the modern world, and how people don't trust it, and rightly so. The first rule of esoteric literacy is never trust a medium. And it's not to say that they don't tell the truth sometimes, it's impossible to verify in most instances. Sticking with the Christian theme, you'll find that many auto-written texts are Christian in scope. We have the Urantia Book. This is an extremely controversial book, and I'll bring this one up next just because of its mysterious origins. There's Dr. William Sadler, who was kind of like the founder and leader of the Urantia groups, which formed in the early 1920s when they began their contacts with something, I'll explain in a second, and went on until either the late 40s or early 50s when the book was published. The book was published in 1952, I think. And so there's about 20 years of where this group, led by William Sadler, were receiving contacts. Now, William Sadler wrote a history about it, which is a separate book, and he describes how he doesn't want, no one in the Urantia book or Urantia group wants there to be a cult of personality built around any medium or any person. So the identity of anyone involved with the composing of the book is left unknown because they want the book to stand on its own merits. They want the contents of the book to stand on its own merits, which is both noble because it shows humility and that the message is more important than the messenger. But it's also a red flag because if some science fiction writer got there to make a fake book, then of course he's not going to want you to look too deeply at its origins if he's trying to fool you into thinking it's a real document. He also likes to stress that it is not like any other case of spiritism, like auto-writing or trance channeling or anything like that. And he claims it's completely different, 100% different from any other case of spiritism that was very common in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and that it stands completely apart from all the seances and trance channelers and everything like that. But then he goes on to say that the first contacts were through a sleeping medium, that a man who would sleep at night, he would be in a state of sleep that allowed him to be open to these spiritual entities that could speak through his mouth, and they could ask and receive questions through this medium. Then he also goes on to say that throughout those 20 years, they were in contact with people who looked like, normal flesh and blood people who were actually like these angelic beings. They didn't know it at the time. They thought they were just having like deeply theological conversations with complete strangers and took it for granted, just thinking that, having a nice conversation with someone at a cafe about theology and Christ and stuff. But then they later discovered that these were actually the spiritual entities in human form talking to them, which reminds us of Abraham in Sodom and Gomorrah, when those angels came to his door and they knocked on the door, they shook hands, they were made of flesh and blood, they required food and water, they needed to be protected from a mob that wanted to rape them. And so there's this idea that the angels can be these flesh and blood humans as well, if they so choose. Or, extraterrestrial theorists will say that they were aliens that looked like humans. Whatever it was, the Urantia book they say they don't want to reveal where it came from, but then Sadler kind of reveals where it comes from. It's a little contradictory. And he says it's different from all the other forms of how scriptures have been written, but then he relays these stories where it's actually no different at all from the stories of Abraham and the stories of trance channelers in general. So it's contradictory. Also, the book has a complete different theology than anything you've probably ever heard. All these multiple universes and how they're governed. And when you read it, it has a hypnotic feeling to it, which that should be a red flag. If you feel yourself like going into this suggestive state, you need to snap yourself out of it because it could be trying to put ideas in your head that shouldn't be there. And when I read that book, I definitely have this feeling of like, it's gently washing my brain as I read this like super confusing theology. So you can judge a tree by the fruit it bears. I don't know too much about the Urantia groups that have grown out of this movement, and there are many of them. They're all over the world now. They got like tax exempt status as a religion and stuff like that. Some people believe that it was an MK Ultra experiment. The government joint Russian, French, German, American mind control experiments that have been going on for like the last 100 freaking years. So some people think that the Urantia book was just an MK Ultra mind control experiment. But that could be true. There are a lot of auto-written documents that might be the case. They have the voice to skull technology. So this is another thing you have to look out for with trance channelers and mediums and voices in the head, is that they have a microwave beam tool that can transfer words and ideas and images into somebody's mind from a distance, and they can make it sound like it's coming from the sky or from your own head, and they can make the voice sound however they want, and then transmit that directly by stimulating somebody's brain with microwave energy. And then they call it voice to skull or V2K technology, and that has existed since the late 40s. So imagine what they could do today. So you always have to be concerned about that sort of thing when dealing with mediums. The Urantia book has a lot to do with the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. That's one of the big sections of the book. And again, they do go through the ethics and morality, and the morality that they teach isn't so bad. It seems to be congruent with the New Testament. But again, the book is highly confusing and very dense, and I don't want to come up with any premature opinions just because of when I read it, I kind of wasn't really into it. So I don't want to share any opinions that could be totally unfounded. But it doesn't seem like that harmful of a book. I don't know. Christians seem to hate it. People are very suspicious of it, and that's fine, for good reason. It's a very weird book. Sticking with the Christian theme, we have a book that was trance-channeled by a man named Levi Dowling. And he was an American. This is called the Aquarian Gospel of Jesus the Christ. He channeled it between 1888 and 1908, so it took him about 20 years to trance-channel this book out. He was a pastor in the Church of Christ. He was a chaplain in the Union Army during the Civil War. He was a proponent of homeopathic remedies and stuff like that. And the most important thing you need to know about him is that he was a teacher of the so-called New Thought movement, which was an American movement developed in the middle of the 19th century. It was basically like the American version of the Psychical Research Society of England that, Charles Dickens was in there researching like ghosts and stuff like that, and seances and things. That was what was happening in America, and they studied spiritistic phenomenon and all sorts of the weird stuff and auto writing and things like that. So, Levi Dowling claims that through his work with the New Thought Society, he learned how to go into a trance state to look through the Akashic record, and then something happened where his hand was overtaken. It's not clear if it was overtaken by a spirit or the Akashic record itself or whatever, but he was in a trance auto-writing state of mind when he wrote the Aquarian Gospel, which regards the 12 missing years of Jesus' life. When, between the ages of 10 and 14 or something like that, he leaves Palestine, Syria, and he goes, the New Testament just says he goes into the desert or he goes into the east. And they don't really talk about those 12 missing years. And then he comes back and is baptized in the Jordan River by John the Baptist. This book claims to fill in those gaps that he looked through the Akashic record. He saw that Jesus went to the Egyptian mystery schools and learned from the high priests there, that it parallels the 40 days of temptation in the desert, where Jesus goes to these initiation rituals where the high priests tempt him with political power, they tempt him with wealth, they tempt him with sex, they tempt him with drugs, they tempt him with all sorts of things to turn him away from God, but he passes through all the trials. He learns from the priests and passes all the trials effortlessly like a perfect human would. He debates with the priests on theology and morality, and he wins all of the debates, and the priests are so impressed with him that they believe that he must be the prophesied Messiah. And they anoint him as such, and then he goes back to Palestine where he is then baptized. So it doesn't contradict the gospel, it's just an attempt to fill in the blanks. The morality is the same as the teachings of Jesus, so there is no contradiction there. Again, the official church and Orthodox doctrine or dogma is that it's bullcrap. You shouldn't read it, it's evil, deception, don't bother with it. I believe it's a totally harmless book, and it's worth reading. It's interesting. It's basically a description of what the Greek and Egyptian mystery schools were like, and it's sort of like the last chapter of the mystery schools, because of course after Jesus, the mystery schools are no longer necessary. So it's interesting in that regard. If you're interested in esoteric history, you can sort of see it as an overview of what the mystery schools were like and why Jesus rendered them obsolete. On the Christian side of things, this will be like the last overtly Christian example, is A Course in Miracles. This was dictated by a woman named Helen Schuckman in 1976. She didn't auto-write it. She heard the voice of Christ in her head, and she just wrote down exactly what he said. And she wrote it in the first person. Like, Jesus would say, I am, and she would write, I am. She wrote down exactly what Christ told her to, and that's what she claims. And it's mostly a book for priests. It's to sort of encourage you to continue with the priest craft. But it is denounced by the Orthodoxy because they believe it to be a Gnostic text. The book says that the human race, is collectively, like, they call it the Son of God or the sonship, that the whole human race, being children of God, are the Son of God, and that they are asleep. We are asleep. We rejected God, or we wanted to experience life where God did not have very much influence in our lives. So we went to sleep and created this dream that is this world. So we created the world by dreaming it up in a state of sleep, because we wanted a world where we could live without God and sort of make our own mistakes and stuff like that. So that's kind of a Gnostic view. You know, the Gnostics will say that like an evil God created the world, whereas this Course in Miracles book says that it was like we created the world through our own like neglect and ignorance or desire to be without God, and that we have to now wake up. And the book tells you, like, you know, your connection with God and how you should reinvigorate your connection with God and wake up from the dream you're in. So, you know, again, take it or leave it. Christians don't like it because of the Gnostic thing. They can't believe that the world is fake. They have to believe the world was created by God because the book of Genesis says so. And so in that regard, it contradicts the book of Genesis, so therefore they hate it and don't want to read it. But honestly, it's a really beautiful book. It is loaded with just superb ethical and moral teachings. It's more of an exercise in ethics and morality than anything else, and it is quite a beautiful book. Whether you want to believe it or not, it's really good to just read it to get like a bolstering of ethics. And the funny thing about it is that that book has actually turned people into Christians, as it's turned people toward the church. So I don't know why the church and the Orthodox Christians would be against it, because it encourages Christianity, it reinvigorates the lives of priests, and encourages priests very deeply. So take it or leave it. It is what it is. The next one that I'd like to discuss has some Christian themes, but it is about the whole world. This is a very controversial one as well. It is called Oahspe. It's a big, thick guy. And this one's very interesting, extremely controversial. It was published in 1882 by a man named John Ballou Newbro. And he auto-wrote the text over the course of, I think it was 3 or 4 years. And he was from Brooklyn, New York City. And he was a 33-degree Scottish Rite Freemason. So there should be all kinds of red flags going off in many of your minds about that. So that, to me, tells me that is probably an authentic auto-written text. Now, the book says that he channeled a bunch of different angelic ambassadors of Jehovah. Every night was like a different ambassador from Jehovah who took over his hand. He would go into a trance state. He would wake up in the middle of the night, go into a trance state, and just write and write and write. And if you look at the original manuscripts, it is in so many different handwritings. It does look honestly like a whole bunch of different people wrote this book together. But his wife was there the whole time, and she left him because of it, because he would get very, very tired. The trance channeling really took it out of him, and it would go on all night. And then by the morning, he would be exhausted from it, and he wouldn't be able to go to work. So he lost his job, couldn't pay the bills, and all that sort of thing. So his wife left him. She just couldn't handle it. So it seems to me that it was an authentic auto-written text. Now, if it's a deception or not remains to be seen. The book describes the history of the human race from all the different cultures. It goes through like all the different prophets, like Moses and Zoroaster and Jesus and Lao Tzu and all the Chinese prophets, African prophets, Native American prophets, South American prophets, and Middle Eastern, and so on and so forth. It'll have like one chapter from the perspective of the angels, and then it'll tell you like the same story from the perspective of the prophet who lived through it on earth. So it'll be like an angelic perspective of an episode of history, and the human perspective of the same episode in history. So each chapter is kind of doubled up like that. It has a lot to do with UFOs. It was actually the first time the word starship was ever used. These beings, these angelic angels that make these ships out of spirit energy, and they have the appearance of long metallic cigar shapes, flying saucers, what we would call flying saucers, sometimes made out of light or what looks like metal to a person. And this was published in 1882. This was even before the airship sightings of the late 19th century, of 1892, when people started to see that blimp, that metallic blimp that was flying around at top speeds, at high speeds. So this was like really presaging the UFO phenomenon that would take over the 20th century. A pretty long while before anybody even used the word UFO or flying saucer, this guy was using the word starship to describe these angel ships. And these angel ships, they contained hundreds or thousands of angels in them, and they take the souls of the departed human beings up into heaven. And the book warns you that there are many different heaven realms, and there are deceivers who make their own heaven realms who want you to believe that they are God. So they get you to believe in them on earth because they get energy from your worship and your prayers. And this is why people join certain religious sects or certain cults, because they were fooled by a spiritual entity into worshiping them. And then when they die, they will be visited by some type of imposter, some spirit who looks like Jesus, or who looks like Buddha, or who looks like one of your ancestors or one of your family members, and will tell you to, like, you know, come with me to heaven, and you'll go with them into this false heaven with a false god, and you'll be deceived, and you won't be in the highest heaven. That you have to go through another series of resurrections, that they're called resurrections, where you die once, which is your first resurrection into the lowest heaven, where you have to do some work for the will of God, and then when you fulfill that job, that cosmic job that God has you do, then you go to a higher, you sort of spiritually evolve to the next heaven, where God will have you do more work in the universe, in the physical and spiritual universe as like an angel, and then another resurrection to the higher and higher levels. And these resurrections occur by your soul entering these starships, and they bring you to the next level of heaven. And until you get to the level of heaven, the highest heaven, where Jehovah lives. And, you know, it just makes me think, like, well, if there's all these deceiving gods that want you to worship them and go into their false heaven worlds, their false realms, then what's to say that the Jehovah, who, like, is behind this Oahspe book, what's to say he's not one of these deceivers? And he's just trying to get you into his false heaven world and worship him as God. And he might just be another false god. And, you know, you can't prove it just by reading the book. So it's like, the book can lead to like that sort of like paranoid thinking when you're reading it. The whole book could just be some kind of deception. But again, it's a very interesting book. The last chapter of the book says, like, in order for the human world to be at peace, you have to like leave cities, and you need to live like a country lifestyle, what we would call a sustainable or off-grid or eco-village type lifestyle. And it actually describes a prophecy of the future where cities will collapse, people will leave the cities, or the ones who stay will basically just die off in these decaying cities, and the people of God will live in these off-grid, healthy, natural communities of far fewer people. They say no town should have more than 5,000 people in it. They put a number on it. Every town should have 5,000 people in it, and no more, and the cities shouldn't exist. So it's an interesting book. The ethical teachings in the book are good. That little environmentalist community thing about the book I like, but it could all just be a deception. Who's to say this Jehovah isn't a deceiver? I like that it warns you about spiritual deceptions, so that's good. But again, it's a very strange book. Take it or leave it. It's syncretic. It talks about how all the religious traditions are fundamentally the same, or in essence the same. You know, it goes through all the different prophets of all the different traditions and say how they're all just preaching the truth of the Most High God. And whether it was Jesus or Moses or Zoroaster or Lao Tzu or whoever, they're all preaching essentially the same thing. So, you know, people in any Orthodox religion, whether you're an Orthodox Buddhist or an Orthodox Christian or an Orthodox Jew or whatever, they'll hate the book because Orthodoxy says you should avoid syncretism and heterodoxy, because that's heresy. But again, take it or leave it. There's one more interesting trans-channel document I forgot to mention. The Vedic scriptures, the Hindu-Indian scriptures. I just want to briefly talk about it because it's a very interesting case of this auto-written, or not auto-written, but dictated documents, where a sage named Vyasa wanted to write the history of the universe up to the point that he was alive. So he determined to peruse the Akashic record by going into a state where he could see the history of the universe, and then he asked Ganesha, a god, the son of Shiva and Parvati, to write the books for him. So now we have a case of a human being dictating to a god, and the god is now writing the book. I just think that's very interesting. It's unique. There's no other case of that happening, that I'm aware of anyway. And it's just kind of funny. I don't know. It's interesting to think about. And that's the legend of where the Vedic scriptures came from. Now we can get into mediums, more modern mediums, and these popular personalities that were mediums. And of course, you can't really talk about this sort of thing without first mentioning Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society. She was a medium she wasn't a ventriloquist. Like, she didn't get taken over and speak like a trance channeler. She would get telepathic messages and then write them down, fully conscious. She would just write them down word for word in her own handwriting. And she had these psychic sensitivities since she was a child. She wrote 3 books, one really short. Her first book was called Isis Unveiled. Then she wrote The Secret Doctrine and the Stanzas of Gian. The Rosicrucians, including Rudolf Steiner and one of Steiner's students named Sergei Prokofiev, will tell you something very important. And you should read a book by Prokofiev called the East in the Light of the West. Very important book, extremely controversial for New Agers and proponents of Theosophy. They hate Sergei Prokofiev. But he's a Rosicrucian clairvoyant and a student of Rudolf Steiner. And they say that only the first third of Isis Unveiled is worthy of your attention, and the rest of it is a deception. So, Blavatsky received these telepathic messages, and she wrote Isis Unveiled over the course of a few years, a little bit at a time. The people dictating to her the book were 3 ascended masters by the names of Mahatma Maurya, Kut Humi, and Jwal Kul. And they were legitimate ascended masters who had the whole world in their hearts and minds. They loved everybody, and they wanted to develop Western thought. Their goal was to basically help Western humanity become spiritual again, because they're becoming increasingly materialistic throughout, the past few centuries. And they wanted to, reinvigorate the Christian and Western traditions. And the first third of Isis Unveiled is clear. It's quite supportive of Christianity and Western thought. Now, the masters told Blavatsky, and you can read this in her own books, that she was not to discuss these things. She was not to have her own opinions or comments on what she was writing down. That these books that she was dictating were really meant for future generations, for the 20th and 21st centuries. They weren't really meant for her to understand, and that she probably wouldn't understand them properly, so she should avoid commenting them or forming opinions or sharing opinions on what she's writing. And of course, Blavatsky, if you know her, she was extremely arrogant and narcissistic. She tried to overhaul American Freemasonry by saying women should be Freemasons, and she just tried to shake things up because she thought she knew everything. And she was one of those people who was just extremely arrogant. And so, of course, she commented and shared her opinions on what she was writing, because she wanted people to think she was special, that she was chosen, and all of that sort of thing. And so the 3 Ascended Masters abandoned her. They said, she's not who we thought she was, she's not going to do this well, she's already ruining what we're teaching. She's going to seance groups and esoteric research groups and Freemason groups and filling their heads with nonsense about what she's writing. She's lying or making up opinions about it. So they abandoned her. But she didn't realize that they abandoned her. And they were replaced by 3 imposters who used the same names and the same voices and everything like that. And she didn't notice. She did not notice that she was abandoned and that imposters had replaced the 3. Now, of course, theosophers, people in the Theosophical Society and New Agers, they are largely unaware of what I'm describing right now, or the ones who are aware of it like to deny it and say that she was never abandoned and the Ascended Masters are still with the Theosophical Society to this day. Well, you can see in the rest of her writings, the rest of Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine and all that, it is very much anti-Western and anti-Christian. And it begins to say that Christianity requires these injections from Eastern thought. It has to be enhanced by Eastern spirituality, and that Western spirituality is completely lacking and is not a complete tradition. And this is, of course, not true for anyone who understands deep Christianity and Rosicrucian thinking. The Western tradition is complete. It's just been hidden and obscured from us. It doesn't need Eastern thought to be added to it. It's just that the spiritual sciences need to be uncovered because they've been obscured over the centuries by groups of people who don't want you to know about them. So you can see that they're just trying to undermine the Western tradition there. Then Annie Besant eventually takes over the Theosophical Society after Blavatsky dies. And then these imposter masters do something really terrible, where they send these dreams and visions and telepathic messages to Annie Besant to encourage her to exploit and manipulate a little boy named Jiddu Krishnamurti, saying that he is the second coming of Christ, he is the Maitreya Buddha, he's the Kalki avatar, he is, he's the new world teacher, he's the Messiah. And you have to indoctrinate this young boy to be the next world teacher. And Annie Besant was all about it. She was vehement. She dedicated her life to manipulating this boy. And now Annie Besant is a good person. I know what I'm saying doesn't sound like it. She had a good heart. She was a moral, ethical person. She really was. She was a really nice person. But I think she was just kind of an idiot who was taken for a ride and had no discernment. Like most people who are naturally psychic from childhood on, they're very arrogant. They don't think they need to learn or discern things because they feel special, they feel chosen, they feel like because they're psychic they don't have to study basic knowledge like science and history because they think they can just know everything and the angels and masters teach them everything they ever need to know. So they're actually very stupid. They're very ignorant while thinking they're very smart. And I do believe Annie Besant was guilty of that mentality, and so she was easily manipulated by these imposters, who she trusted implicitly because she thought they were the real ascended masters. Now, of course, Steiner then left the Theosophical Society because of this. He knew that there was not going to be a physical bodily incarnation of the Messiah again. The second coming of Christ was when people start having visions of Christ on their own. When Christ shows up to them in his etheric body, he'll manifest like an etheric physical body for the people who are prepared for it, and then it has nothing to do with another incarnation of Christ. That would be redundant, unnecessary. He already came. There's no purpose. His spirit has already been imbued into the earth. There will be no other human incarnation of Christ or the Messiah. It would be absolutely redundant. Krishnamurti agreed with this. He also became old enough to realize that he was being exploited by this cult, and he left as well. And Krishnamurti actually became one of the greatest spiritual teachers ever. So in a way, he was a world teacher. Not the world teacher, but a world teacher. And he was actually the first spiritual teacher that I ever listened to. I had heard audio recordings of him when I was about 9 or 10 years old. And he really woke me up to a lot and helped to put me on the path that I'm on. So he was definitely a great teacher. But I would not consider him a Messiah, or the Messiah. Definitely not. So that was another deception that these fake imposter masters were trying to pull on the world. Again, trying to undermine Western civilization and Christian thinking. Then you have the nail in the coffin of their deception with a woman named Alice Bailey. She was not directly related to the Theosophical Society, but she was a medium in contact with the same 3 imposter masters. And they tried to get her to spread a doctrine of materialism that sounded spiritual. Now, what I'm going to describe to you is the main deception that mediums unwillingly or willingly throw onto their audiences. When a medium, when it is authentic and is actually getting messages from the spiritual world, how do you know it's a benevolent, truthful message or some sort of demonic or dark deception that is being offered by the enemies of humanity? And I would say that this is how you find out, is you study Alice Bailey and look at the subtle doctrine of materialism that is thrown in there. These dark spirits will give you 90% truth, 90% something that is worthy of your attention, just to get you to trust them and to believe the 10% of the lie. And it's the 10% of the poison that's going to kill you. They'll give you 90% sugar just to get you to swallow 10% of the poison. And what Bailey is guilty of is that she unwittingly spread the doctrine, not realizing it was a deception, of the basically putting materialism up on a pedestal. She taught what was called the permanence of the atom. Now, in the material plane, it's true. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, matter, conservation of matter and energy and all that sort of thing. That's true on the material plane, but that's not what Bailey was teaching. She was teaching that matter can enter the spiritual world. This is where that raise your vibration, New Age thing comes from. Now, when you raise your vibration and you want to enter the spiritual world, the material components lose all of their material qualities. A material will have to pass through the etheric medium between matter and spirit. There's the ether. and it will lose all of its material components in the ether, and then it will enter the spiritual world as a completely spiritual thing. And it works in the reverse. A spiritual impulse, or one of the thoughts of God, will pass through the ether, take on material qualities, and then become a material manifestation in the material world. So, spirit is spirit and matter is matter. And the ether either removes the quality of matter or adds the quality of matter. And it's like ice and water. You can have an ice cube and a glass of water, and technically they're made of the same thing, but ice is not liquid water, and liquid water is not ice. They are totally different things. If the ice wants to become liquid water, or enter the realm of liquid water, it must become liquid. And if the water wants to become ice, it must freeze. So if a piece of material, if a piece of matter or a human being wants to become spiritual, it must become spirit. It cannot maintain its material qualities. The ice cube cannot maintain its frozen qualities. It must melt. Alice Bailey would have you think that ice can be in the realm of water. It's literally impossible. You literally can't even imagine it because of how impossible it is. She wants you to think that matter can be spirit. This is the main deception that you will find in these trance-channeled teachings, the ones that are a deception, because they sound spiritual. They can get someone who is a spiritual seeker, seeking spiritual truth, but is perhaps not very well educated on it, and they are the main targets of deception. They will believe themselves to be gaining spiritual knowledge when really they're being deceived into becoming further and further materialistic, more and more materialistic. And this is because the forces of darkness, they want you to be materialists. They don't want you to believe in the spirit. They don't want you to believe in the primacy of the spirit, the superiority of the spirit. They want you to think that matter is superior and that matter is everything. So they get you to think that matter is spirit and matter can be spirit. And then this detracts from our spiritual nature. It completely obliterates our spiritual nature. And I'll do a whole video on these forces of darkness and where they come from, but that's a whole other topic. So that is the main deception you'll find in these trance-channeled and auto-written documents. That's what you have to look for to find what is a truthful and benevolent message and what is a spiritual deception. Another 20th century, or coming into the 20th century, beginning in the 1920s, you have, well, in the 19-teens actually, you have the Vril and Thule societies of Germany. These were the esoteric secret societies who eventually became, who created the Nazi Party. Now, historians will tell you one thing of how the Nazis came out of a political movement, but they really came out of these occult movements that were dealing with trance channelers. Their channelers were these very lovely young women known as the Vril maidens or Vril sisters. And the most famous of them, there were 5 of them, I think. There could have been more. The most famous of them was named Maria Orsic. She was a trance channel, and she was involved with the Vril Society and the Thule Society, and they would have sessions where she would channel an extraterrestrial being from the star system of Aldebaran, which is in the Taurus constellation. This supposed extraterrestrial claimed that they're from a highly advanced civilization and that's where the Aryan race came from. They're originally from this planet, and we had been genetically modified by them, and this is actually where the Nazis got their exotic technology from. Of course, you've probably heard of the Glocke, or the bell, which was used counter-rotating fields of plasmoid mercury to create anti-gravity effects so this machine could fly without conventional propulsion, and some people speculate it may have even been a time machine. They had guns that didn't require ammo that would condense air into a superheated plasma projectile and fire that, so guns that never had to be reloaded, kind of like from the video game Mass Effect. They created flying saucers. Admiral Byrd said that they could fly from pole to pole in a matter of seconds or something like that. They had a lot of exotic technology. Guns that could shoot around corners, they had night vision, all this sort of stuff. And they got it from trance channelers like Maria Orsic and Sigrun, who allegedly got it from extraterrestrials from Aldebaran. Now, Maria Orsic was very famous. She was from like a family of actors and socialites and stuff like that, and she was a celebrity in Germany. And in 1945, she just vanished without a trace. Now, the story goes is that she was involved on a flying saucer project that they were developing with the Vril Society and Rudolf von Sabbatendorf, a machine that could fly faster than light to get to Aldebaran to find out whether or not there actually was an advanced Aryan civilization from that planetary system. And in 1945, she vanished. So people believe she got there because she vanished in January of 45, and then in March of 45, there was a group performing a seance who wanted to contact Maria, and a letter manifested on the table from Maria. And the letter in German, it just said, "Nobody lives here." Very mysterious story. So who was she channeling? If nobody lives in Aldebaran, did she really go to Aldebaran and find it to be uninhabited? Who knows? It's a very bizarre story, but it's a very famous story. Coming up further, we have a person named Jach Pursel, who channeled a being called Lazaris. And he still does this to this day. He began in 1976, and this is one of the more lighthearted and easygoing channeling sessions, where this Lazaris is just like a higher dimensional entity, kind of angelic, who just loves humanity, and he just teaches you how to live like a healthy lifestyle. Again, judge a tree by the fruit it bears. It's difficult to tell if Jach is telling the truth or not, or if he's a fraud, but the message is nice, it's lovely, it's healthy, it's happy, and has had a good effect on lots of people. But that's an interesting one to look into if you're interested. Coming up more present, we have Andrijah Puharich. You may have heard of him. He made Uri Geller famous, you know, the spoonbender, the famous spoonbender. He also made famous a woman named Phyllis Schlemmer. She was a trance channel, and she would channel the so-called Council of Nine. They became famous in the New Age group, and they described themselves as off-world complex intelligences, off-world intelligence complexes, sort of like these non-corporeal entities that have had a hand in guiding humanity for a long time. They channeled through Schlemmer a book called The Only Planet of Choice. And this is a book about how the Earth is basically the only planet in the galaxy that has beings with free will, and that this is a good thing and should be fostered, but it also leads to war and violence, and that humanity's violence needs to be tempered and done away with. The Council of Nine support the idea of a global government. And because they don't want to interfere with our free will, their job is to convince humanity that a global government is the best way to go. And many elite politicians and industrialists and other people have gone to trance channelings of Phyllis Schlemmer and the Council of Nine. Presidents of the United States had gone, and of other countries, and bankers and CIA agents, they'd all gone to listen to the Council of Nine. And they are proponents of a global government. This makes us think about the Maya had this inscription was found in Mexico on a Mayan ruin that mentioned how at the end of every Baktun or era of human society, human time, that the Bolan Yokturku would come. And that translates loosely as the 9 supporting gods. And that they would come and bring a great transition, sometimes bringing war and conflict to change the way human society works. Also, in the 200s BC, you have Emperor Ashoka of India, who was the first to unify India under an empire. And he waged a war to do it, and he realized that he hated war. He was disgusted and so disturbed by the consequences of war, all of the death and destruction that it caused, that he swore he'd never wage war again. And so instead of waging war, he decided to get 9 of the most brilliant humans who lived, tell them each to develop one of the sciences to perfection. These are, physics, anatomy and physiology, biology, psychology, sociology, the material sciences, the spiritual knowledge, all sorts of stuff. And to, find out everything that you could and keep the dangerous stuff secret, keep most of it secret. And we'll create a secret society, and it was known as the 9 Unknown Men. And they Some people think that they found the secrets of immortality this way because it was their job to find all of the sciences, that they became immortal and ascended, and that might explain why they can be channeled now as intelligence complexes. Other people think it was just a secret society where when one of them died, they would replace themselves with just one person, so there would always be 9. But anyway, their job was to work for Ashoka and his lineage of emperors, to that instead of waging war to conquer, he would basically just manipulate what everybody thought and believed and did using these sciences, because he learned about human anatomy and physiology, psychology, sociology, and he would just manipulate people into entering his empire and conquering them that way. Speaking of elites who are interested in this sort of stuff, you had in the 19th century, you had a group called the Orphic Circle, and they were popular in England, and people like Benjamin Disraeli, the Prime Minister of England in the 19th century, was a member of the Orphic Circle, and basically what they did is they essentially exploited little girls who had psychic sensitivities so that they could channel non-human entities to be able to tell the future, forecast future events, surveil their political rivals, learn which monetary investments they should make in which businesses, which technology should be developed to gain their own power, and all that sort of stuff. These politicians would use trance channelers to gain political and economic advantage over their rivals. That sort of thing still goes on today. And in the Orphic Circle, there was a famous girl who had psychic sensitivities, and her name was Emma Britten. And she was used by the Orphic Circle as a trance channeler to talk to non-human entities. And Emma Britten wrote an autobiography of her experiences in the Orphic Circle, which I highly recommend reading. But take it with a grain of salt, because she very much praises the Orphic Circle a little bit too much. It makes you think, like, was she exploited and told to only say good things about them? Or did she actually really like them? It's difficult to say, but it's a little disturbing. So Emma Britten wrote her own autobiography, and you'll find out a lot about the Orphic Circle from her. The most important thing to think about regarding all of this is what Rudolf Steiner called the difference between reason and revelation. Now, all mediumship is obviously revelation. You have some entity, a human or a non-human or something, coming and telling you this is how the world works, this is how the mind works, this is the cosmology, this is cosmic government, this is how all this works, just listen to me, take my word for it. And then you have reason, which is when you use your own intuition, your own insight, your own clairvoyance, and the scientific method to verify all of these things on your own, with your own thinking, your own free thinking. That's the path of reason. Steiner stresses that the path of reason is far superior to the path of revelation, because the path of revelation has all those pitfalls that I've been talking about. Deception, fraudulence, who knows if it's just a split personality disorder and some suppressed personality coming to the forefront that seems like a channeled being. There are all sorts of pitfalls to the path of revelation. And so the path of reason is far better, and we should strive to do that. It's more difficult, more time-consuming, takes more effort, and can seem more uncertain, but it will lead you eventually to the truth, and you can trust that because you're using the scientific method coupled with spiritual thinking. So scientific thinking and spiritual thinking nicely in harmony with your own freedom of thought. You're not putting your thought processes into the hands of some alien or some angel or something else. You're thinking for yourself and not letting anyone else think for you. And that's what's most important. That's why, rule number 1 of esoteric science is don't trust a medium. You should trust yourself and your own thinking and your own intuition and your own heart. And you should not take anyone's word for anything, and you should always verify whatever you are told by someone and not take anyone's word for it. So that will conclude this episode of Esoteric Literacy. I thank you very much for watching, and the next episode will be quite interesting. I think you'll like it, and have a good day.